American history teaches three things as facts. Columbus arrived first. Africans arrived as slaves. Native nations stood alone. All three collapse under evidence. Because before the United States existed, Africans and indigenous peoples were already connected in the Americas, trading, intermarrying, fighting together. That alliance was later dismantled on purpose. Start with Columbus himself. In his journals, Columbus recorded that indigenous people told him about black men who had arrived before him, coming from the east in large boats. They traded weapons tipped with metal unfamiliar to the islands. Columbus collected those weapons. They were analyzed in Spain. They matched West African gold-copper alloys. That detail alone contradicts the official timeline. Across the Caribbean, Central America, and Mexico, indigenous oral histories repeat the same claim. Dark-skinned visitors arriving before Europeans, trading goods, leaving descendants. Archaeology supports it. Colossal stone heads in Mexico, dated centuries before Columbus, display broad noses, full lips, and African cranial proportions. Mainstream explanations call them stylized, but no comparable stylization exists elsewhere in Mesoamerican art. Old World crops, cotton, bananas, appear in pre-Columbian soil layers. These plants don't drift across oceans. People carry them. That alone raises one question historians avoid. If Africans were already present, then black people were never newcomers to the Americas, and that changes everything. Now fast forward. When Europeans began enslaving Africans, escape routes formed immediately, but the destination wasn't vague wilderness, it was native territory. By the 1600s and 1700s, thousands of escaped Africans were absorbed into native nations, especially in the southeast. Seminole Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. Africans brought military skills, farming knowledge, and intelligence. Native nations offered land, protection, and political inclusion. These communities weren't runaway camps. They were armed settlements. The most dangerous of them were in Florida. The Black Seminoles were not fugitives hiding. They built fortified towns deep in swamps Europeans couldn't navigate. They practiced guerrilla warfare, controlled trade routes, and raided slave catchers. The United States tried to destroy them. They failed. The Seminole Wars became the longest, most expensive Indian wars in U.S. history, not because of native resistance alone, but because of black native military coordination. This terrified the government, because enslaved Africans now had proof of something dangerous: freedom, land, and weapons together. So the U.S. changed tactics. If you can't destroy an alliance with force, you destroy it with paperwork. Enter the Daws rolls. In the late 1800s, the U.S. forced native nations to register citizens, but instead of recording families accurately, officials split black Indians into a separate legal category called freedmen. Same parents, same tribes, same land, different label. By blood meant land, voting rights, and citizenship. Freedmen meant exclusion. This wasn't accidental. It fractured black native families overnight and legally erased African ancestry from tribal identity. Treaties signed in 1866 promised freedmen full tribal rights forever. Those promises were later ignored, but the alliance didn't vanish. It adapted. Black Indians carried their land knowledge, trade networks, and self-governance west. They built independent towns, places designed to avoid white economic control. One of them became so successful it threatened the national order. Greenwood. Tulsa's Greenwood district, later destroyed in one of the worst massacres in U.S. history, was fueled by people who already understood collective defense, land ownership, and exclusion from white systems. Many were descendants of black native alliances. This documentary is not speculation. It's about evidence that Africans were in the Americas before Columbus, how Black Seminoles defeated the U.S. Army for decades, how the Daws rolls legally erased black Indians, why treaty promises still matter today, and why descendants are still fighting for recognition. This story was buried because it proves one thing: black and indigenous people didn't just survive America, they built it together. And that alliance scared the country enough to erase it. But before America tried to erase it on paper, it tried to erase it with force. Florida became the proving ground. By the early 1800s, enslaved Africans weren't just running away, they were running toward something. Native nations, especially the Seminole, offered protection, not secrecy, protection. And once Africans entered Seminole territory, they weren't treated as property or temporary guests. They were absorbed. They married into families. They learned the land. They carried weapons. Entire settlements formed that were part African, part native, and fully armed. These weren't scattered hideouts. They were planned communities built deep in terrain Europeans couldn't control. Swamps, wetlands, dense forests that turned military formations into liabilities. The U.S. government knew exactly what was happening. Plantation owners complained that Florida had become a leak in the system. Enslaved Africans were escaping faster than they could be captured. Worse, they weren't just disappearing, they were fighting back. The Seminoles refused every demand to return them. That refusal triggered war. Not a short one, not a clean one, a grinding failure. American troops marched into Florida expecting to overpower scattered resistance. Instead, they encountered a coordinated network that understood the land better than any map could capture. Black Seminoles didn't fight in open fields. They didn't line up. They didn't announce themselves. They struck supply lines, ambushed patrols, vanished into water and brush. U.S. soldiers wrote about enemies they couldn't see until it was too late. Entire units got lost chasing fighters who left false trails, doubled back, or waited silently in flooded terrain. The swamps did the rest. Horses sank, weapons rusted, heat and disease broke morale, and the most dangerous part wasn't even the fighting. It was the example. Every escaped African who reached Seminole territory proved something the system couldn't allow to spread. Freedom wasn't theoretical. It existed. It was armed. It was defended. The U.S. responded by escalating. More troops, more money, more destruction. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, families targeted. Still, resistance continued. Black Seminoles and their native allies refused surrender for years longer than anyone expected. This wasn't symbolic resistance. It was strategic survival. At one point, the war became so costly and embarrassing that officials openly admitted they couldn't win outright. The solution wasn't victory. It was separation. If the alliance couldn't be destroyed in battle, it had to be split. So the government shifted tactics. Negotiations weren't aimed at peace anymore. They were aimed at fracture. Native leaders were offered survival, land, treaties, relocation, but only if Africans were excluded. Some refused and paid for it. Others were cornered into impossible choices. By the 1830s, forced removal began. Seminoles were pushed west under threat and violence. Black Seminoles were captured separately. Some illegally sold back into slavery. Others marched west under the same removals. But even then, the alliance didn't fully break. Some Black Seminoles escaped again, this time crossing into Mexico, where slavery had been abolished. There, they became border defenders, soldiers, citizens. Let that register. Africans escaped U.S. slavery, fought the U.S. Army, then became free military settlers in another nation, all before the Civil War. That reality never fit the American story, so the government learned its lesson. Force alone wasn't enough. As long as black people and native people could claim each other as kin, as family, as nation, America's racial system didn't work. Slavery depended on isolation. Removal depended on separation. Power depended on identity being controlled, and identity was about to be rewritten, not with bullets, with categories. And once identity became paperwork, the erasure could look legal, clean, and permanent, because the next move wasn't about land or war, it was about deciding who counted and who didn't. And once that line was drawn, families would be split forever without a single shot fired. They didn't need soldiers anymore. They needed clerks. Once identity became paperwork, the alliance could be dismantled quietly, permanently, and without headlines. This is where erasure stopped looking violent and started looking administrative. The tool was called the Daws rolls. On the surface, it sounded neutral, a census, a registry, a way to document native citizens so land could be divided fairly. That was the story sold to the public. But the structure of the Daws rolls tells a different story. Instead of recording families as families, officials split people into categories they didn't choose. Not by culture, not by community standing, not by lived reality, by blood. And blood suddenly meant something very specific. If you were native without African ancestry, you were listed as by blood. If you had African ancestry, even if your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were native, you were listed as freedmen. That word did enormous damage because freedmen didn't mean citizen. It didn't mean landholder. It didn't mean equal. It meant conditional. Two siblings could stand in front of the same registrar, born to the same parents, raised in the same nation, and be placed on different rolls. One received land allotments, the other received nothing. One had future voting rights, the other didn't. One was recognized as native forever. The other was quietly pushed out of history. This wasn't accidental error, it was policy. Federal officials understood exactly what they were doing. The Daws rolls reduced native land ownership by millions of acres, and at the same time, they severed black Indians from tribal identity using a pen instead of a gun. The timing matters. This happened after the Civil War. In 1866, treaties were signed between the U.S. government and tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Those treaties were explicit. They promised that freedmen and their descendants would have full tribal citizenship, equal to by blood members. Not temporary, not symbolic, forever. Those promises were made in exchange for land, peace, and allegiance. Then they were ignored. When the Daws rolls were created decades later, treaty obligations were quietly overwritten. Freedmen were relabeled as outsiders within their own nations. Citizenship became something that could be revoked retroactively, and here's the key detail that rarely gets mentioned. This division didn't just benefit the federal government. It benefited certain tribal elites, because once land allotments were distributed, fewer recognized citizens meant larger shares for those still counted. Identity became currency, and black Indians paid the price. Families lost land that had been held communally for generations. Descendants were told they no longer belonged to the very nations that had protected their ancestors, all because of a classification they never agreed to. But the erasure didn't erase competence. Black Indians didn't disappear. They reorganized, pushed off tribal roles, excluded from promised land. They pooled resources and did what they had always done, built independently. They formed towns, not shanty towns, not temporary camps. Structured communities with schools, banks, newspapers, farms, and businesses. These towns weren't accidents. They were designed responses to exclusion, places where black Indians and other black settlers could own land outright, govern themselves, and defend their economic independence. One of those places sat in Oklahoma, Greenwood. Tulsa's Greenwood district didn't emerge out of thin air. It was fueled by people who already understood what happens when you rely on systems that can revoke your identity overnight. Many of Greenwood's founders had direct ties to Indian territory. Some were freedmen descendants. Others were native citizens pushed to the margins. All carried knowledge of self-governance learned through exclusion. They built banks because they were denied credit. They built schools because access was restricted. They built protection because history had taught them to expect violence. Greenwood became so successful, it earned a nickname that terrified the surrounding power structure: Black Wall Street. That kind of success wasn't supposed to happen. Not after removal, not after segregation, not after legal erasure. And it didn't last. When Greenwood was destroyed, it wasn't just racial violence. It was the continuation of a pattern that began with the Daws rolls. Break the alliance, isolate the descendants, erase the proof. But the paperwork didn't finish the job, because treaties still exist, because records still exist, because descendants still exist. Today, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and other freedmen descendants are still fighting for recognition promised over a century ago. Court cases are ongoing. Tribal constitutions are being challenged. History is being reopened, not because of sentiment, because the documents are clear. The alliance didn't disappear, it was buried. And the deeper you dig into the records, the rolls, the treaties, the censuses, the clearer it becomes that America didn't just erase black Indians accidentally, it engineered the disappearance, and what was built afterward, the towns, the economies, the resistance, was built by people who knew exactly what had been taken from them. The next part of this story isn't about loss, it's about what survived, and why the country is still uncomfortable acknowledging it. They survived because disappearance was never total. It just became harder to see. After Greenwood burned, after land was stripped, after names were crossed out of rolls, the assumption was simple. Without recognition, the people would fade. No land, no citizenship, no leverage. That assumption was wrong, because black Indian communities didn't rely on recognition to know who they were. They relied on memory, kinship, and paper trails the government didn't fully control. Church records, family Bibles, land deeds predating allotment, military enlistment files, oral histories passed with precision, not nostalgia. And those records started resurfacing. Here's the part most people don't understand. The fight today isn't about feelings or identity politics. It's about contracts. The treaties of 1866 are still legally binding. They were never repealed. They were never replaced. They were simply ignored. Those treaties guaranteed freedmen and their descendants equal citizenship in the 5 tribes. Not conditional, not temporary, equal. When tribes later rewrote constitutions to exclude freedmen, they did so in direct violation of federal treaty law. That contradiction sat quietly for decades, until descendants started suing, and winning. In 2017, a federal court ruled that Cherokee freedmen are citizens under the treaty. No blood quantum required, no DNA tests, just the law. That decision sent shockwaves, because if the Cherokee case holds, it sets precedent for the Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations. And that means land rights, voting rights, benefits, representation, everything the Daws rolls were designed to strip away. This is why the resistance is so fierce. Recognizing freedmen descendants doesn't just correct history, it reopens it. It forces a confrontation with how much land was redistributed based on exclusion. It challenges who gets to define native after centuries of intermarriage, alliance, and shared survival. And it exposes a truth that makes people deeply uncomfortable. America didn't just separate black and native people through slavery and removal. It did it after emancipation, using law instead of chains. Even now, the language used against freedmen descendants is revealing. They're told they're not really native, that their ancestry doesn't count. That culture can be inherited, but only selectively. But here's the problem with that argument. Freedmen didn't assimilate into tribes later. They were already there. Many were bilingual. Many held tribal offices. Many fought in tribal militias. Some were enslaved by tribal members, then freed, then adopted as full citizens, exactly as tribal law allowed at the time. Blood quantum wasn't a traditional native concept. It was introduced by the federal government to measure, limit, and eventually erase, and it worked, partially. Because while paperwork erased people on record, it couldn't erase the infrastructure they built. Across Oklahoma, Florida, Texas, and Arkansas, there are towns, cemeteries, and land parcels that tell the story quietly, places where surnames repeat across generations, where native languages mixed with African traditions, where resistance wasn't loud but constant. The Black Seminoles are a perfect example. After fighting the U.S. Army to a standstill in Florida, some fled west, others fled south into Mexico. Yes, Mexico. They negotiated freedom in exchange for defending the border. They maintained their language, leadership, and identity for generations outside U.S. control. That alone should destroy the myth that black Indians were passive or dependent. They weren't surviving by accident. They were surviving strategically. And that survival created a problem, because modern America prefers clean categories: black or native, slave or citizen, before or after. Black Indians break those categories. They prove Africans were here before Columbus. They prove alliances existed that weren't built on domination. They prove American history didn't unfold in straight lines. And most dangerously, they prove that progress was interrupted, not inevitable. That's why this history stays buried. Because once you acknowledge Black Indians, you have to explain why they were removed from textbooks, roles, and recognition. You have to explain why treaties were violated. You have to explain why thriving communities like Greenwood were destroyed instead of studied. And you have to explain why descendants are still fighting for promises made over 150 years ago. This isn't ancient history. It's active. Every court case, every tribal election, every archive request is part of the same struggle that began when Africans and Native nations chose alliance over isolation. They weren't erased because they were weak. They were erased because they were proof of something powerful. That cooperation worked. And if it worked once, it could work again. That's the part that scares people the most. Because once you strip away the mythology, what's left is evidence. Hard, uncomfortable evidence. Start with pre-Columbian contact. Not legends, not vibes, evidence. West African currents flow straight into the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. The same currents Columbus later used. African sailors understood them centuries earlier. That's not speculation. It's oceanography. Now look at artifacts. Olmec heads with African facial structures. Pre-Columbian metallurgy matching West African alloys. Linguistic overlaps between Mande languages and indigenous terms along the Gulf Coast. Each one alone gets dismissed. Together, they form a pattern. Africans didn't arrive in America as slaves first. They arrived as sailors, traders, and survivors. Some integrated into native nations. Others formed independent Maroon communities. Over time, those communities became something new, Black Indians. Fast forward to the 1600s and 1700s. Runaway Africans flee plantations. Where do they go? Not into the woods alone. They go to native nations that already know how to resist colonial expansion. The Seminoles didn't just accept Africans. They armed them, gave them land, let them marry in, made them allies. That alliance terrified the United States because enslaved Africans plus native terrain knowledge plus guerrilla warfare equals something the U.S. Army couldn't control. That's why the Seminole Wars were so brutal, not because they were misunderstandings, but because they worked. Black Seminole fighters knew the swamps. They knew hit-and-run tactics. They knew how to vanish. The U.S. Army lost repeatedly to people it claimed were inferior, so the government changed strategy. If you can't defeat an alliance militarily, you destroy it legally. Enter removal. The Trail of Tears didn't just remove native nations. It severed Black native communities. Families were split. Africans were re-enslaved. Others were reclassified as property instead of citizens. But even removal didn't finish the job. After the Civil War, the U.S. made a promise it didn't intend to keep. The treaties of 1866 weren't symbolic. They were explicit. Freedmen were to be full tribal citizens. Voting rights, land rights, protection, permanently. That should have ended the story. Instead, the government introduced paperwork designed to divide people again, the Daws rolls. This wasn't a census. It was a sorting mechanism. People were forced into categories by blood. Freedmen, same families, same ancestors, different columns. Once you're in the freedmen column, something changes. You lose land allocations. You lose inheritance rights. You lose political voice. And crucially, your descendants lose recognition. This wasn't a mistake. It was design. Because once land could only pass through blood, millions of acres became transferable to white settlers and corporations. Greenwood didn't emerge despite this system. It emerged in response to it. Black Indians and freedmen pooled resources, built banks, built schools, built businesses, created towns that didn't rely on white approval. Tulsa's Greenwood wasn't an accident. It was a continuation. That's why it was destroyed. Not because it was successful, but because it proved something dangerous, that Black and Native descendants could build parallel systems without permission. After the massacre, the story was buried. Records vanished. Insurance claims were denied. Survivors were silenced. And again, people assumed the lineage would disappear. But it didn't. Because descendants kept documents, kept names, kept memory alive when institutions wouldn't. Today, Those descendants are using the same tool once used against them, the law. They're citing treaty language line by line, challenging tribal constitutions rewritten under federal pressure, forcing courts to acknowledge what was always there. This isn't about identity, it's about contracts violated, and the implications are massive. Because if freedmen's citizenship is fully restored across tribes, it reshapes voting, land access, and governance. It forces tribes and the federal government to confront how much exclusion was imposed, not inherited. This is why you don't hear this story cleanly told. It collapses too many narratives at once. It shows Africans weren't late to America. It shows Native nations weren't isolated. It shows slavery didn't define black beginnings here. And it shows prosperity was sabotaged, not absent. Black Indians aren't a footnote. They're the connective tissue between America's most inconvenient truths. And the fight isn't over. Because recognition isn't just about the past. It determines who controls land, history, and power right now. That's why this history matters. Not because it's tragic, but because it's unfinished. Because unfinished history doesn't stay in the past. It shows up in courtrooms, land deeds, and voter rolls today, right now. Descendants of Black Seminoles, Cherokee Freedmen, Creek Freedmen, Choctaw Freedmen, they aren't asking for symbolism. They're demanding enforcement. They're pointing to treaties the U.S. government itself wrote, signed, and ratified. Treaties that explicitly say freedmen and their descendants are full citizens. No qualifiers, no expiration dates. So how did tribes legally remove them anyway? Pressure. After allotment, the federal government quietly encouraged tribes to rewrite constitutions. Blood quantum became law. Citizenship shifted from political belonging to biological math. That wasn't traditional, it was colonial. Before contact, tribes didn't define membership by fractions. You were adopted, you were in. You fought, you belonged. You married, you became family. Blood quantum was introduced for one reason: land shrinkage. Every time citizenship narrows, land consolidates. Every time land consolidates, it becomes easier to lease, sell, or seize. That's why freedmen exclusion spikes whenever money is involved. Casinos, oil rights, federal funding, follow the incentives, always. Now zoom in on Florida again. The Black Seminoles didn't just vanish after the Seminole Wars. Some fled to Mexico. Others stayed hidden in plain sight. Some joined Maroon settlements deep in swamps no army could penetrate. These communities maintained autonomy for generations. Armed, organized, independent. The U.S. labeled them outlaws because it couldn't classify them. They weren't enslaved. They weren't foreign enemies. They weren't legally native, because admitting that would validate the alliance. So they were erased administratively. Same playbook, different century. Then there's Oklahoma. Indian Territory was supposed to be a refuge. Instead, it became a laboratory for dispossession. Black Indians built towns like Boley, Langston, Taft, fully functioning black-led municipalities. Greenwood wasn't alone. It was just the most visible. And visibility made it a target. When Greenwood was burned, land didn't disappear. It changed hands. That pattern repeats everywhere you look. Remove recognition, undermine claims, redistribute assets. That's why modern freedmen lawsuits matter far beyond tribal politics. If courts enforce the treaties of 1866 fully, it sets a precedent that treaty law still outranks racial exclusion, that the U.S. can't selectively honor agreements when convenient. That terrifies institutions built on selective memory, because if this door opens, others follow. Land claims, voting rights, reparations debates reframed through treaty violations, not morality arguments. That's the real reason this story stays fragmented. Textbooks separate Africans from natives. Museums isolate timelines. Academia treats Black Indians as anomalies instead of outcomes. But the lived reality never separated them. Shared enemies create shared futures, and the descendants know this. That's why DNA isn't the centerpiece of these battles. Documents are: enrollment records, census discrepancies, court rulings quietly acknowledging treaty breaches but stopping short of enforcement. The fight now is procedural, slow, deliberate, exhausting by design. Delay is a weapon. Every year recognition is postponed. Elders pass without seeing justice. Land changes hands again. Political power shifts. And yet, the pressure is building. Social media didn't create this movement. It exposed it. Descendants found each other, compared records, noticed patterns. Realized exclusion wasn't personal. It was systemic. Once that clicked, silence stopped working. Tribes are now forced to answer uncomfortable questions. If freedmen fought alongside ancestors, why are their descendants excluded? If treaties guarantee citizenship, who has authority to revoke it? If blood quantum was imposed by the U.S., why defend it as tradition? There are no clean answers. That's why resistance looks emotional instead of legal. Because legally, the ground is unstable. And this isn't about attacking native sovereignty. That's the deflection. It's about confronting how sovereignty was reshaped under coercion and who paid the price. Black Indians paid it first. They were erased because they complicated every colonial category. Too African to be native. Too native to be African. Too independent to control. So the system tried to delete them. It failed. Because erasure doesn't work when memory is organized. And now, history isn't being requested. It's being reclaimed. Not as a feel-good narrative, not as representation, but as enforcement of agreements written in ink and sealed by law. That's why this isn't over, and why the next phase isn't about proving existence. It's about forcing accountability. Good. Then we raise the temperature and tighten the blade. Because here's the part nobody says out loud. Black Indians were erased not because history forgot them, but because they were too dangerous to remember. Dangerous to the slave system. Dangerous to westward expansion. Dangerous to the lie that America was built by separate races who never stood together. That lie collapses the moment you tell this story properly. Let's go back to the beginning. Before treaties, before Daws rolls, before paperwork existed to bury people. Africans didn't arrive in America as cargo first. They arrived as people who could run, fight, and negotiate. Spanish records from the 1500s already describe Africans escaping plantations and vanishing into native territories. Not hiding, joining. Why? Because native nations already understood something the colonizers didn't. Freedom survives through alliance. Africans brought metalworking knowledge, military experience, and languages shaped by trade. Native nations brought terrain mastery, survival systems, and political structure. Together, they created something the colonies couldn't control. That's why Florida terrified the U.S. government. Not because of swamps, because Black Seminoles broke the logic of slavery. You couldn't re-enslave someone who lived inside a sovereign native nation, spoke multiple languages, and could disappear into land your army didn't understand. Runaway Africans didn't just flee to the Seminoles. They became Seminoles. They married in. They fought in wars. They held leadership roles. And the U.S. knew it. That's why the Seminole Wars weren't about land alone. They were about destroying a working model of black freedom inside America's borders. 3 wars, decades of fighting, billions in today's dollars spent for one tribe. Ask yourself why. Because as long as Black Seminoles existed, every enslaved person knew escape was possible, and possibility is contagious. When removal failed, the U.S. changed tactics. They didn't defeat the alliance militarily. They erased it legally. Fast forward to Indian Territory. After forced removals, tribes were promised autonomy. Instead, they were surveilled. The Daws rolls weren't neutral records. They were weapons. Officials showed up, decided who was Indian by blood and who was freedmen, often based on skin tone alone. Families were split on paper. Same parents, same grandparents, different categories. One line determined land access, the other erased inheritance. This wasn't ignorance, it was design. Because when land allotment hit, by blood meant acres. Freedmen meant nothing. And when oil was discovered in Oklahoma, that difference turned into wealth or exclusion overnight. That's how Greenwood becomes possible and vulnerable. Black Indians didn't just build Tulsa's prosperity, they financed it. Freedmen land leases funded black banks. Black banks funded businesses. Businesses created a self-sufficient economy the state couldn't dominate. Greenwood wasn't a miracle. It was a consequence of denied access elsewhere, and when it became too successful, it was burned. Not just buildings, records, titles, claims. Notice the pattern yet? Erase people, seize land, rewrite history, deny it ever existed. Now jump to the present. Tribes defend exclusion as sovereignty. The U.S. hides behind tribal authority. Both know the treaties exist. Both know enforcement would expose decades of illegal exclusion. That's why cases drag on. That's why rulings are partial. That's why recognition is promised but never completed. Because recognition doesn't just restore identity. It restores claims, and claims threaten power. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Black Indians sit at the intersection of every American contradiction. Slavery versus freedom, sovereignty versus control, race versus citizenship. You can't resolve their story without unraveling the system that erased them. That's why textbooks avoid it. That's why museums separate Africans and natives into different wings. That's why schools teach slavery and removal as parallel tragedies instead of interlocking systems. But the descendants don't need permission anymore. They have receipts, treaties, court precedents, federal acknowledgments buried in footnotes. And now they have visibility. The fight isn't about convincing skeptics. It's about forcing institutions to answer questions they've avoided for 150 years. Questions like, if Black Seminoles were recognized warriors, why aren't their descendants citizens? If freedmen were promised equality, who had authority to revoke it? If blood quantum was imposed by colonizers, why is it defended as tradition? There are no safe answers. That's why this story matters now, not as nostalgia, but as leverage. Because the alliance wasn't erased, it was postponed. And what happens next depends on whether history stays fragmented or finally told as one connected truth. By the time the courts got involved, the damage was already done. Because once identity became paperwork, violence didn't need weapons anymore. It needed clerks. After the Civil War, the U.S. forced tribes to sign the treaties of 1866. These weren't symbolic. They were explicit. Tribes that had held enslaved Africans were required to emancipate them and grant them full tribal citizenship. Not partial, not conditional, full. On paper, Black Indians won. In reality, the fight had just changed form. When the federal government decided to dissolve tribal land into private ownership, it created the Daws Commission. Its job wasn't just to list people. Its job was to decide who deserved land. This is where the erasure accelerated. Enrollment agents weren't historians. They weren't elders. They were outsiders instructed to simplify identity into two columns. Indian by blood, freedmen. That's it. No room for mixed ancestry. No recognition of Black native lineage. No acknowledgement of adoption, marriage, or clan systems. If you look Black, you went in the freedmen column, even if your family had been native for generations. And here's the key detail most people miss. Freedmen were almost always listed without blood quantum. That omission mattered later, because once tribes began tying citizenship to blood percentage, freedmen had no number to prove. The system was designed to age them out. One generation later, tribes could say, you don't meet the requirement, and the U.S. could say, it's an internal tribal matter. Clean hands, erased people. Now zoom in on Oklahoma. Indian territory was flooded with displaced tribes, Black Indians, and freed Africans all competing for survival under new rules. Some adapted faster than others. Black Indians understood banking, land leasing, mutual aid. That's how Greenwood formed. It wasn't just a Black town. It was a Black Indian economic hub, built by people who had already learned how quickly security could disappear. They built banks because land could be taken. They built schools because access could be denied. They built hospitals because no one else would serve them. Greenwood wasn't loud, it was efficient, and efficiency made it a target. When Tulsa burned, it wasn't just racial violence, it was economic warfare. Insurance claims denied, land titles challenged, survivors displaced again. Notice what didn't happen? No restoration, no federal reckoning, no return of property. The same silence that followed Seminole removal followed Greenwood. Erase, delay, move on. Now fast forward again. Today, Black Indian descendants are still fighting for recognition inside the same tribes their ancestors defended with weapons, not for symbolism, for access to health care, education, land dividends, political voice. They're told the same thing over and over. You're not really one of us, even when the treaties say otherwise, even when the rolls prove lineage, even when federal law backs them. Why? Because recognition costs money, and more importantly, it redistributes power. If freedmen are reinstated as citizens, voting blocks shift. Resource allocation changes. Leadership legitimacy gets questioned. So delay becomes strategy. Court cases stretch for decades. Rulings get narrowed. Appeals reset the clock. The system counts on exhaustion. But here's what changed. Records went digital. Archives open. Families connected across states. What was once buried in dusty ledgers is now searchable, and the narrative is cracking, because Black Indians don't need to prove they existed. They need institutions to admit why they were excluded. That's a much harder question to answer, and the closer that answer gets, the harder it becomes to pretend this was accidental. It wasn't. It was engineered, and the next layer of this story exposes exactly who benefited from that engineering, and who's still benefiting today. What almost nobody talks about is what happened after the erasure worked. Because once Black Indians were pushed out of citizenship on paper, something else followed quietly: replacement. Across Oklahoma, Florida, and the Southeast, land that once belonged to Black Indian families didn't just sit empty. It was absorbed, released, reclassified, sometimes rediscovered decades later under different names: oil leases, timber rights, railroad easements. And here's the uncomfortable part. Some of the same tribal governments that deny freedmen citizenship today are still receiving federal benefits tied to lands freedmen helped secure. That's not emotional. That's accounting. Take Oklahoma's oil boom in the early 1900s. Allotments that were stripped from freedmen through tax seizures or legal technicalities didn't disappear. They were consolidated, and when oil was found, the beneficiaries weren't the descendants of the people originally listed on the land. They were whoever remained on the rolls. This is why recognition fights are so bitter now. It's not about ancestry pride. It's about assets: healthcare funds, education grants, land revenue, casino distributions. Recognition isn't symbolic. It's expensive. And that's why modern resistance looks so familiar. Freedmen. Descendants show up with documents, treaties, birth records, enrollment numbers, and they're met with silence, procedural delays, or redefinitions of belonging. Same playbook, different century. Now let's talk about something even more buried: the military alliances. Before removal, Black Indians weren't just families, they were strategic partners. Black Seminoles weren't auxiliaries, they were tacticians. Their knowledge of terrain, escape routes, and supply lines made Seminole resistance last longer than any other Native conflict in U.S. history. That scared the government, because a Black-Native alliance didn't just resist removal, it disrupted the entire racial hierarchy the U.S. was trying to impose. If Black people weren't inherently subordinate, if Native nations weren't vanishing, then manifest destiny collapses, so the alliance had to be reframed. Textbooks reduced Black Seminoles to runaways. Freedmen were rebranded as former slaves. Native nations were depicted as fragmented. Divide the story, and the alliance disappears. But here's the detail historians whisper about. During the Indian Wars, U.S. commanders explicitly warned against Black-Native cooperation. Internal memos describe it as destabilizing, not militarily, psychologically, because it showed something dangerous. Solidarity worked, and when solidarity works, control fails. So after bullets didn't do the job, bureaucracy did. Now jump to the 20th century. When Jim Crow hit Black America, Black Indians didn't get an exemption. They were too Black for tribal protection, too Native for white acceptance. That limbo forced them to build independently. That's why Black Indian communities produce lawyers, doctors, educators, and entrepreneurs at abnormal rates. They had to. No fallback systems, no safety net. That resilience didn't go unnoticed. federal agencies began studying these communities, not to help, but to understand how they survived exclusion. And what they found was dangerous again: kinship networks, mutual credit systems, shared childcare, land pooling. Sound familiar? Those systems are the backbone of Greenwood, of Rosewood, of Eatonville. Black Indian influence runs through all of them, not as folklore, as infrastructure. And when those towns were destroyed, something else was targeted besides wealth: memory, records burned, deeds lost, family lines severed. Because if you erase continuity, descendants can't trace claims. Which brings us to now. DNA testing is reopening doors institutions thought were sealed. But here's the twist: DNA alone isn't enough. Because tribes don't recognize DNA, they recognize documentation. And documentation was the very thing manipulated. So descendants are caught in a paradox. Prove lineage using records that were designed to erase you. That's not a flaw, that's design. But cracks are forming. Independent historians are cross-referencing census data with tribal roles. Church records are filling gaps federal archives ignored. Land maps are exposing how parcels moved suspiciously fast after freedmen were excluded. And courts are starting to notice. Not loudly, not yet, but quietly. Which is always how reversals begin. Because if Black Indians regain recognition, it doesn't just restore families. It rewrites the moral foundation of American expansion. It proves that Africans weren't just brought here. They were already here, already allied, already building. And that truth threatens more than pride. It threatens legitimacy. And the moment legitimacy collapses, everything built on top of it starts shaking. The question now isn't whether this history is real. It's whether the institutions that benefited from erasing it can survive its return. And the final piece of this story answers something even bigger: why this alliance had to be buried so deeply that most people don't even know it existed. Because once you see it, you start asking a dangerous question. What if the future they feared is the one still trying to be born? Here's the part that makes institutions nervous. Black Indians didn't vanish, they adapted. While America was busy pretending the alliance never existed, descendants kept marrying, organizing, teaching, and passing down memory in ways paper couldn't erase. That's why this history keeps resurfacing. Because buried truths don't stay buried when the people carrying them survive. Today, Black Indian descendants are filing lawsuits that don't ask for sympathy. They demand compliance. They're not saying recognize us because it's right. They're saying recognize us because it's law. Treaties aren't suggestions. They're binding contracts. And when courts are forced to read them without the filter of tradition, the conclusions get uncomfortable. Because those treaties never expired. They were ignored. And ignoring law isn't the same as nullifying it. Now here's the moment nobody wants to talk about. If Black Indians regain full recognition at scale, it sets precedent, not just for tribes, for the entire American legal framework built on selective memory. Because suddenly, land titles get questioned, resource distributions get audited, sovereignty arguments get complicated, the myth of clean separation collapses, and with it, the idea that American identity was ever neat. This is why pushback is so aggressive, why debates get emotional, why people say this will divide us. It already did. The division just benefited certain people, and now those benefits are being challenged. Look at the pattern. Every time Black Indians organize, the response isn't historical debate. It's procedural obstruction, missed deadlines, reinterpreted definitions, jurisdictional loops, delay until exhaustion. But something has changed that no previous generation had: visibility. Social media didn't invent this history. It removed the gatekeepers. Suddenly, descendants don't need permission to tell their story. They don't need a publisher. They don't need a museum exhibit. They have archives. They have receipts. They have each other. And when that network activates, erasure stops working. Because erasure depends on isolation. This alliance was always dangerous because it broke isolation. Africans weren't alone. Natives weren't alone. Together, they built something the system couldn't easily dominate. That's the real reason this history was buried. Not because it was weak, because it was strong, because it offered an alternative blueprint, one where identity wasn't binary, where belonging wasn't racial purity, where freedom was collective. That model threatens every hierarchy built on separation. So the story was fragmented. Africans became a labor narrative. Natives became a disappearance narrative. The alliance was erased, so neither could claim leverage, but now the fragments are reconnecting. And when fragments reconnect, they stop being fragments. They become structure. That's what you're watching happen in real time. Not a history lesson, a reassembly. And here's the part nobody can undo. Once people understand that Black presence in America didn't begin at the bottom, once they see that resistance, land ownership, governance, and alliance were already in place, the entire story of power shifts. Because you can't tell someone they started with nothing when they can show you what was taken. You can't argue inferiority when the record shows strategy, endurance, and survival under coordinated pressure. You can't pretend this was accidental when every step of erasure required planning. This isn't about nostalgia, it's about trajectory. What was interrupted, what was delayed, what is now resurfacing. And the final truth is this: the alliance didn't fail. It was paused by force, paused by law, paused by silence, but pauses end. And when they do, history doesn't politely re-enter the room, it breaks the door. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. If Black Indians had been allowed to remain visible, if the alliance had been acknowledged instead of buried, what would America look like right now? Who would control land? Who would define citizenship? Who would decide belonging? That's why this story matters. Not because it's tragic, but because it's unfinished. And unfinished stories don't stay quiet forever.